We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Ago and immediately ran into trouble. One of its main engines failed just after takeoff, but mission control told the astronauts they had enough velocity to reach orbit. The latest news is that the Challenger will be recalled after only one orbit, lower than planned. If the mission is aborted, the shuttle would either land at White Sands, New Mexico, or return to a landing strip at Cape Canaveral.
The latest mission of the Space Shuttle Challenger. The flight nearly ended just minutes after takeoff when one of the shuttle's main engines failed and mission control came within seconds of ordering an emergency landing in Europe. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson.
The launch was an hour and a half late, but at least to start with, everything went perfectly.
3, 2, 1. Ignition and liftoff. We have liftoff of Challenger in Space Lab 2. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
The shuttle, carrying £50 million of scientific instruments and 7 astronauts, behaved well. Then a heat sensor on one of the engines warned of rising temperature in a fuel pump. The middle engine finally shut down automatically, 3 minutes early, losing the shuttle vital power. A second engine warning light came on, but the astronauts disconnected it. To reduce weight and to give it as much lift as possible, an orbital maneuvering engine had to be switched on. The mission was saved, but to NASA's horror, the shuttle had come within 30 seconds of making an emergency landing in somewhere like Spain. There was relief that at last the mission will go ahead, if at a lower orbit.
The crew is doing fine, and as of now, we're pretty optimistic about achieving all of the objectives, essentially all the objectives of the mission.
The scientists are disappointed that some experiments can't now be done because the shuttle isn't high enough, but at least it's still flying.
The failure was the third in this particular mission. Earlier this month, the original launch was aborted 3 seconds before liftoff, and last night's rescheduled launch was delayed because of a fault in the navigation.
At first, it looked like a good launch for the Space Shuttle Challenger, with 13 scientific experiments on board. It was a little late. 3 weeks ago, the launch was aborted with only 3 seconds to go in the countdown, but it was now on its way. Then things started to go wrong with the shuttle's main engines. 3 minutes and 30 seconds into the launch, a sensor found main engine number 1 was overheating. 2 minutes 10 seconds later, a second sensor confirmed this, and the engine was shut off. The first time ever an engine had failed on a shuttle flight. If it had happened 30 seconds earlier, Challenger would have been forced to make an emergency landing at an Air Force base in Zaragoza in Spain. But NASA decided to fly on with 2 engines into an orbit lower than planned. Even more dramatically, a second sensor then showed another engine was overheating. NASA told the shuttle astronauts to overrule it. If that engine had failed, the shuttle would have been forced to land on Crete, or, in the words of a NASA official, we would have been in the water. By now, Challenger should have been in an orbit more than 200 miles high, but because of the engine failure, reached only 168 miles altitude, too low for some of the scientific experiments on board. NASA has since managed to boost the orbit by almost 10 miles, and scientists with experiments in the Space Lab on board Challenger told Channel 4 News more than 90% of the science can still be done. Nevertheless, after yesterday's scares, it seems the shuttle isn't yet the reliable space bus NASA hoped it would be.
working properly now, and that's essential for their main experiment. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson explains what's been going wrong.
The countdown went smoothly enough, and to start with, so did the launch.
3, 2, 1.
But several minutes after liftoff, a warning light indicated a high temperature in one of the fuel pumps. The center engine shut down automatically, 3 minutes early, robbing the shuttle of vital power. A second engine warning light came on, but the astronauts disconnected it. To burn up fuel and make the shuttle lighter, 2 of its small engines were turned on. But without full thrust, the shuttle ended up in an orbit 40 miles lower than expected. The mission will go ahead, but some experiments are likely to suffer, particularly the British one studying the sun. After the shuttle lands, engineers will find out whether the warning system itself was faulty or whether the engines really were in danger. If something serious was going wrong, then it could weaken confidence in the shuttle. The shuttle has a checkered history. Several satellites it's launched have failed to reach proper orbit. But the vehicle itself has also had its problems. This launch in September '83 almost ended in disaster when a solid rocket booster nearly burnt a hole in its engine nozzle. The following mission in December that year had computer problems and a small fire on board just before touchdown. In June last year, Discovery's launch was delayed by several problems. Last April, a tile fell off Discovery during re-entry, leading to some structural damage, and the shuttle burst a tire on landing in a crosswind. Then 2 weeks ago, Challenger's launch was stopped 3 seconds before liftoff when an engine valve stuck. Each shuttle is a very complex machine designed for 100 missions. It has proved itself invaluable in some jobs, mending and rescuing satellites, for example, and it's essential to America's plans for a space station. But some are now beginning to question whether it is as reusable.
Shortly after launch yesterday has run into more problems. The astronomy telescopes in the European Space Lab carried in the cargo bay cannot be maneuvered, and there are also problems with 2 solar experiments. But NASA officials say they hope to repair all the equipment.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition and liftoff.
The takeoff looked perfect. 3 huge engines blasting the Challenger into the sky. 12 days late, but on her way. Then, just 6 minutes into the flight, 70 miles above Earth, a crisis. An onboard computer ordered one of the huge engines to shut down. The voice from mission control was calm enough, but the shuttle was in danger.
We have a center engine down on the Challenger. The crew has been instructed to abort to orbit.
By just 33 seconds, the shuttle was high enough for the crew to head for an emergency orbit. The center engine had been automatically shut down when a high-pressure fuel pump began overheating. Then another sensor showed another overheating engine was about to shut down. NASA guessed it was just an instrument failure and ordered the crew to override the computer. If 2 engines had failed at that critical point, the result could have been disastrous. We could have been in the water, said a NASA spokesman. And even while NASA investigate the Challenger breakdown, stories are emerging of poor quality control in the newly built shuttle Atlantis. It was found on inspection to have fuel lines contaminated with aluminium shavings and human hairs. Inspectors said this could have led to a fire or even an explosion. But the good news from space tonight is that almost all the experiments on this highly technical mission, including 2 from the United Kingdom, will be carried out. Ken Reese, News at 10, Washington.
Astronauts on board the American Space Shuttle Challenger are working to salvage what they can from a scientific mission which is going badly wrong. Challenger is now in a low but safe orbit after near disaster during takeoff. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell is watching the mission.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition and liftoff. We have liftoff of Challenger in Space Lab 2. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Liftoff was perfect, with no sign that Challenger was coming nearer than ever before to disaster. We saw the 3 main engines blasting Challenger towards orbit, but then one overheated and shut down.
We have a center engine down on the Challenger. The crew has been instructed to abort to orbit.
In emergency, the shuttle had 3 options. The first, to try to turn back to the launch site. The second, to make an emergency landing at Saragossa in Spain. Or, third, to struggle into orbit. And that's what Challenger did, by burning a third of the fuel meant to keep it going a whole week. This main engine failed, and a second would have shut down too, meaning Challenger would have fallen into the sea, but for quick action by the shuttle's commander. So far then, for British scientists who've been planning this mission for 10 years, it's been a disaster. After being launched a fortnight late, Challenger ended up in the wrong orbit for their experiments. And now a new German...
California, safely ending a mission which began with an emergency as one engine failed. Now scientists in the United States and in Britain can begin sifting through the wealth of information that's been gathered by the 7 astronauts.
The launch may have been shaky, but the homecoming was flawless. The shuttle's mission had been extended a day at the scientists' request, so they could gather more data. It was a scientific mission. All 13 experiments on board worked well in the end, including the 2 British ones. One from Birmingham University discovered new X-ray sources in space. Another from the Mullard Space Science Laboratory studied the helium and hydrogen in the sun. During the mission, a tiny satellite was released to float free for a while before being put back in the cargo bay. A shuttle's eye view of the weather revealed a string of thunderstorms with frequent and vivid lightning flashes and spectacularly clear skies, providing exceptional pictures of the colourful Earth. Touchdown was perfect. Both the scientists and the American Space Agency were relieved that what had begun as a near disaster had ended in triumph.
Mission which turned out a great success, despite its shaky start. The touchdown was at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Challenger's crew of 7 were in space for 8 days, one more than scheduled. The problems of the beginning of the mission were with the main engine, which shut down and sent the shuttle into a lower orbit than planned. But they made the best of it and collected a vast amount of information on the sun, the upper atmosphere, and distant galaxies. Among the experiments on board were 2 from Britain.
It's bringing serious flooding and very high winds to 500 miles of coastline from Louisiana to Florida.
Dawn on the Gulf Coast this morning and the calm was deceptive. For 100 miles to the south, Hurricane Eleanor was churning northwards, the most dangerous storm of the season, and it may be the worst for years. Much of the information about the hurricane has come from the crew of the Space Shuttle Discovery. They've been tracking it all along. They've been able to see it, we haven't, but we do know that the winds within it are now put at 95 to 100 miles an hour, and the storm is increasing in ferocity as it lingers over the Gulf Coast. The people who live down here have been through this before, most recently for Hurricane Danny 2 weeks ago. But Eleanor is a storm of an altogether different order. Coastal communities are battened down from Louisiana all the way to northwest Florida. 200,000 people have been evacuated, and they haven't been asked to leave their homes, they've been told to.
Possible. It's a mandatory evacuation.
They did get out. The main roads north from the Gulf cities have been jammed with traffic. New Orleans was virtually emptied yesterday and Pensacola today. And those who haven't fled are housed in some 50 emergency shelters in 4 states, staying there even in places where the storm is unlikely to strike because its direction is so uncertain. The beachfront communities are waiting for the blow to fall within a matter of hours.
British record in the skies above Devon, but they're still one short of the world's longest stack.
The Royal Marines freefall team were so determined to break the world record they jumped by moonlight last night. It was a gamble that almost paid off. The stacking maneuver is difficult enough to perform in the best of conditions, but they managed to equal the European record with a column of 22 men with barely enough light to see each other. Each member of the freefall team is allotted a particular position in the stack. Pinpoint timing is needed to coordinate the drop. They have to pick their spot through the clouds, but the pressure doesn't seem to have dented their sense of humor. The men in the stack say the weight of supporting all those underneath them feels like it's stretching them several inches each time they try it. And every time they've fallen to the 3,000-foot mark, they've failed to get that extra man on, which would allow them to equal the world record. One of the main reasons behind the attempt on the world record is to raise money for a charity called Air Aid to help the starving in Ethiopia. It only takes another 2 men on the stack to beat the American record. They're not going to give up till they do it. David Chater, News at 10 in Devon.
200,000 Americans in 4 states are fleeing tonight from a hurricane expected to strike in the next few hours with torrential storms and 100-mile-an-hour winds. Hurricane Elena is advancing on a 350-mile front from the Gulf of Mexico. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama and Florida are all on full alert. Emergency workers on the coast say they are preparing for the worst. The shuttle Discovery is monitoring from the air.
Roger that. A dramatic view from space as the shuttle astronauts look down on the gathering storm.
Patterns that are not quite organized into one yet. If they ever decide to join up, it ought to be a good one.
Up to 3 million people live along the coast where the hurricane is expected to strike. A mass evacuation of many of them is now underway.
All persons must leave the island immediately. This is a mandatory evacuation.
120,000 people have so far fled the approach of Hurricane Elena, currently building up strength off the Gulf Coast. In coastal areas, people have been boarding up their homes as best they can before hurrying inland. Small boats are running for shelter along a 250-mile stretch of the Florida and Louisiana coastline. As people prepare to evacuate, there's been a run on supermarkets. Shelves are emptying of essential supplies. There are long queues at petrol stations. At one town, they left this farewell note, and astonishingly, still a few people on the beach, determined to have their holiday, hurricane or no. Ken Reese, News at 10, Washington.
Weathermen aren't sure where it'll come ashore. Eleanor is currently south of Apalachicola, heading eastwards towards the densely populated coastline north of Tampa. The Florida coast is already feeling the effects of Eleanor's powerful winds. 300,000 people have had to leave their homes after the state governor ordered the evacuation of low-lying areas. Flooding has affected many districts as high tides and heavy rain batter the coast. There are predictions the storms will cause $1 billion worth of damage, which would make them the worst to hit America for many years. 2 American astronauts from the shuttle Discovery have begun a 6-hour spacewalk to try to repair a faulty satellite. It's been stranded in space since April because of an electrical failure just after its launch. The astronauts have been trailing the satellite SYNCOM-3 for nearly 3 days. It's almost identical to another one which the shuttle's crew launched in the first part of their mission. If the astronauts can complete the repair today, they will return to Earth on Monday. Astronaut James Van Hoften will attempt to restore SYNCOM-3's power by installing new electrical connectors. It took 2 long spacewalks and a lot of patience to complete the job. Kathy Hunt in London has been looking at the pictures.
The astronauts spent 7 hours outside the shuttle on Saturday, wrestling with the errant satellite SYNCOM-3. It's been spinning uselessly in space since April because of an electrical failure. They managed to maneuver it onto Discovery's robot arm and into the cargo bay. They installed new equipment, bypassing the faulty circuits. The satellite then flickered into life. Today the astronauts successfully put the final touches to their repairs. But it'll be another 2 months before the real test. Then a signal will be sent from the ground, igniting the satellite's rocket to put it into its proper orbit. The SYNCOM satellite belongs to an American communications firm, but it's leased to the Navy. The rescue mission has cost $10 million.
And that's all for now. The longest American spacewalk yet. Their aim was to repair a faulty satellite, SYNCOM-3. It had been stranded in space since April because of an electrical failure. The astronauts restored its power by installing new equipment. It enabled ground controllers to bypass faulty circuits.
I gotta get the base arm levers put away first. Okay. I'm going after Mrs. Bag here. Roger, copy, Fish.
The astronauts' record-breaking spacewalk lasted 7 hours. They're expected to return to Edwards Air Force Base in California tomorrow.
Yeah, but they'll bring it in line. You can stop it.
A little impulse there.
Yeah, you need to pitch the nose down a little bit.
I can see that. I got the feel of the reference. Just do like you said. Put your hand on it. I've been doing that the whole time. No problem. Back me out some, Mike, if you're going to look at this thing in a while. Get a
They've fixed the crippled satellite they tracked down yesterday and have now sent it spinning back into orbit.
Day 2 of this epic rescue attempt. After the longest spacewalk ever by man, there was still 4 hours more work on the satellite to be done, installing temperature sensors so that ground control can tell when the deeply frozen fuel aboard is warm enough to fire the satellite into life. At last, astronaut Fisher, strapped to the cargo bay wall, removed the bar with which they had tethered the satellite to the shuttle. Then, with it precisely over the equator, astronaut Ox van Hoften became the first man ever to launch a satellite with his hands, pulling furiously at what he called this beast to get it spinning so that no part of it would become overheated by the sun.
Good roll, Ox. Very little coning. Looking good, Ox. It's a good steady spin and you're right on attitude. Well, there that bad boy goes.
Well, there that bad boy goes, called out astronaut Van Hoften as he stood on the robot arm, astronaut Fisher standing on the cargo bay wall, the satellite upon which they'd worked for 11 hours, no longer between them, but out spinning in space. There it will spin until October. Only then will the fuel be warm enough to ignite the rockets to lift it into its service orbit. Only then will the insurance companies know where the versatile man in space has clawed back the £50 million they thought they'd lost. John Snow, ITN, Washington.
As they repaired the satellite, the astronauts had an out-of-this-world view of Hurricane Elena, which is still lying off the Florida coast. The winds have increased to 100 miles an hour, whipping up waves to a height of 20 feet. More than 1 million people have been moved out, but many are ignoring warnings and returning home.
Over 110 miles an hour. It's the worst storm for several years, with heavy rain and violent seas causing severe damage. The hurricane's expected to hit the coastline near Cedar Key at any time, but already nearly 1 million people have been evacuated from their homes to places of safety. From the storm coast, Martin Bell reports.
Cedar Key, the nearest point on the coast to the hurricane, was battered this morning with winds gusting at 60 to 70 miles an hour, threatened with another 12 to 15 inches of rain and tides 8 feet above normal. The damage so far?
Somewhere probably between $5 and $10 million. The road's just about completely cut through at the next bridge up. We won't know until this thing's over with. It's probably one of the worst ones we've had in many a year.
On the outskirts of the town, the police had set up roadblocks to stop people who wanted to return to their homes from trying to do so. The looting that had happened further south was unlikely to happen here.
Anywhere you go, you'll have a looting problem, but in our area, we're not faced with it like you are in the big cities.
But you're still protecting against it?
Oh, yeah. We're protecting the people's property and homes while they're gone.
Looting was unlikely anyway in conditions where it was almost impossible to stand up, where the police and the wildlife had the town to themselves, and where the only bridge into Cedar Key is likely to be washed completely away in the strengthening gales today. Elena is now reclassified as a major hurricane. For 2 days she's been undecided what to do. The fear is now she'll strike northwards to the populous Florida Panhandle. The people who live near this coast are getting impatient. For 2 days now they've been pounded by the outer edge of this storm, and the worst of it is that this isn't the worst of it yet.
2 astronauts from the American Space Shuttle Discovery have finished repairing a satellite which has been stranded in space for 5 months. It took 2 long spacewalks and some tricky electrical work to do the job. But if it is a success, it will put into service a satellite worth $85 million. Kathy Hunt in London has been looking at the pictures of the rescue mission.
The astronauts spent 7 hours outside the shuttle on Saturday, wrestling with the errant satellite SYNCOM-3. It's been spinning uselessly in space since April because of an electrical failure. They managed to maneuver it onto Discovery's robot arm and into the cargo bay. They installed new equipment, bypassing the faulty circuits. The satellite then flickered into life. Today the astronauts successfully put the final touches to their repairs. But it'll be another 2 months before the real test. Then a signal will be sent from the ground, igniting the satellite's rocket to put it into its proper orbit. The SYNCOM satellite belongs to an American communications firm, but it's leased to the Navy. The rescue mission has cost $10 million.
With 125-mile-an-hour winds. It's hitting Mississippi hardest. It spent 4 days lurking in the Gulf of Mexico gathering strength. Then it headed for New Orleans. 1 million people in 4 states have fled their homes.
It was a contest between man and nature, and they fought it to a draw. After so many false alarms up and down the coast, the authorities reacted fast when it was clear that the indecisive hurricane had finally made up its mind. In the middle of the night, people living in coastal areas in parts of 4 states were urged to leave their homes, and for many of them, it was the second time they'd had to do so in 4 days.
We've driven 500 miles this weekend trying to outrun it to Gainesville and back.
Yeah, I'm going to be real tired when I go to work Tuesday morning. I'm going to be real tired.
At 3 o'clock in the morning, traffic was jammed on the one highway leading west from New Orleans, a town that's especially vulnerable because so much of it lies below sea level. But in the French Quarter, people were partying as if there were no tomorrow, which in their case was nearly true.
Well, okay, they tell me I'm scared to death, so they tell me drink and I won't worry about it, so I drank. That's right.
But Elena didn't visit New Orleans. Instead, she scraped the Gulf Coast with gales and high tides from Florida across Alabama and Mississippi, finally heading inland at Biloxi. The overall damage offshore and on is only now beginning to be calculated. It certainly runs into the hundreds and millions of dollars. But from a hurricane packing winds of 125 miles an hour, the damage could in fact have been worse than it was. And so far as is known, no more than 2 lives were lost. And there is relief along the Gulf Coast that Elena, after all the huffing and puffing, finally came ashore. One of the strongest, strangest hurricanes in years. This is Martin Bell for the 9 o'clock news on the Gulf Coast.
Paulie Parrott to cope with. First on BBC One, Paul McDowell and today's News Round.
Straight to number 1, dancing in the streets, raising money for Africa. Hello, the single Dancing in the Streets, made by David Bowie and Mick Jagger, especially for the Live Aid concert, has shot straight to number 1 in the pop charts today. It was only released a week ago, but already almost 500,000 copies of the record have been sold. All of the profits raised by the record will go towards the Live Aid Fund for famine victims in Africa. Dancing in the Streets is the first time Bowie and Jagger have performed together. There had been rumours that they would appear on stage together at Live Aid, but they came up with this video instead. The American Space Shuttle Discovery safely touched down under 3 hours ago at the Edwards Air Force Base in California. With the details now, here's Newsround's space editor, Reg Turnhill.
Discovery's long glide back to Earth is now routine, even though the landing in California was 9 minutes before dawn. The shuttle still has to land in the desert because they don't yet trust the brakes for landing on Cape Canaveral's concrete runway, and the first thing Commander Engel checked was the state of his tires. With this last success, NASA hope they've shown that the shuttle is safe and reliable, and there should now be a record 10 flights this year. The next, a secret military mission flown by the new shuttle called Atlantis. Just before the landing, Hurricane Eleanor provided the astronauts with dramatic pictures. These were sent back as they passed 480 kilometers above the Gulf of Mexico. In the center, the eye of the hurricane, and at the bottom, violently flickering lightning.
Finally, the shuttle astronauts have been trying their hands at a spot of mechanical repair work deep in space. They successfully located a broken-down satellite, then set to work with their sophisticated toolkits.
Sunrise over Hawaii, the disabled cylindrical satellite above the shuttle's open cargo bay, the astronauts already spacewalking. 2 hours later, in a triumphant moment, hoisted towards the slowly turning satellite, spacewalker James Van Hoften caught hold of it.
I think I got it, buddy. Okay, hold on tight. I will.
Laden with 3 tons of volatile fuel, this satellite, worth £50 million, is not the coziest of objects to stay at close quarters with. It all started in a giant swimming pool in Houston, Texas, where scientists in a £1 million mock-up tried to simulate underwater with a look-alike satellite the conditions that would prevail today. Back out in space, Dr. William Fisher, one of the spacewalkers, performed a type of bypass surgery to cut out the failed starting mechanism on the satellite. He then installed a new starting trigger that in October, ground control will fire from Earth in a signal transmitted to a new and critical antenna.
Omni, fire. Here she comes. Looking good. Looking good, buddy.
The riskiest, costliest and most complex rescue yet attempted in space, heavily dependent upon man himself, the Americans are desperate for it to succeed. The shuttle itself is fast losing its competitive edge against the unmanned European launch rockets, which are for the moment boasting a better record for putting satellites into space without problems. John Snow, ITN, Washington.
And roughly with a record spacewalk to its credit. The landing was punctual and smooth, despite some doubts about a strong crosswind which forced a change of runway. Discovery's 5 astronauts launched 3 new communication satellites and mended an old one during their 7-hour spacewalk.
Hurricane Elena, now downgraded to the status of a tropical storm, has caused damage reckoned in hundreds of millions of dollars. The governors of Mississippi and Louisiana have appealed to President Reagan to declare a state of emergency along their coasts.
The Soviet leader
was looking for new ways to confuse image and reality.
But you can always tell that an image on the screen isn't real because you can see round it. How involved you get depends a lot on how much of your field of vision it occupies. The larger the screen, the more impression it makes. Hence the move to bigger and bigger screens. However, as long as you can see anything around the edge with the corner of your eye, you know it's only a moving picture. But when the picture's all you can see, then you really feel you're in it.
This cinema screen is 54 feet high and 63 feet wide, and from any seat in the auditorium, it's all you can see. The system is called IMAX, and the film and its projector are on an equivalent scale. They have to be. The more the film is magnified by the projector, the more it shows up the grain and spoils the illusion of reality. So, IMAX has to be shot not on 16mm film, nor on 35mm film, but 70mm. And sideways, giving the largest possible picture area, 10 times that of a normal 35mm film. With film that size, the reels for a 30-minute epic are 1.7 miles long and weigh 120 pounds. Running through the projector at 330 feet a minute, they have far too much inertia for a conventional vertical projector, which physically grabs and holds each frame of film in front of the shutter 24 times a second.
So this horizontal system has an ingenious rolling loop
which continuously builds up just enough slack in the reel for the individual frame to pause momentarily in front of the projection gate, where a vacuum holds it steady. It's then fed back to the spools of film, which keep running at a constant rate.
But there's one remaining blot on the perfect image. Wherever you go on Earth, there's bound to be some dust and dirt between the camera and whatever it's looking at. So for their latest film, IMAX took their camera into the clarity of space.
The pictures they brought back were of a quality nobody had ever seen before, and gave NASA scientists a new vision of the Earth, its surroundings, and the shuttle itself. weightless environment inside the shuttle, the astronauts could operate and maneuver the huge camera far more easily than on Earth. A camera which has now travelled 8.5 million miles.
And for any film directors anxious to produce some really authentic space sequences, NASA is now taking commissions for future shuttle journeys. There are problems though. You'll have to plan the whole thing 2 years in advance. And of course, if you don't like what you get, it's an awful long way to go back for a reshoot.